Hi, my name is Kate Gilbert. I'm originally from Merrimac. I went to Kentucky University in New England, and I just graduated from Tufts University with a degree in museum studies. And this program is a combination of everything that I've learned about the Titanic and about the 100th anniversary memorial cruise that I just sailed on. So enjoy.
Gentlemen, welcome to Merrimac and Merrimac Public Library. I am Steve True, past Deputy District Governor of District 33N and currently President of the Merrimac Lions Club. Tonight we're having a little fundraiser for the iResearch program, and this being the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, which is one of the most famous and tragic sea losses in the maritime industry of human life, lost back at the turn of the century in 1912. I think this is the 100th anniversary. Back in those days, remember, communications, telegraph and radio was just in infancy. They had trouble getting communications, and in essence, they signaled when the Titanic started being sinking, and it signaled from one ship to the next ship who related to another ship who went to New York. It's not like they did today, and also in those days they didn't man the telegraph office on the ship 24 hours a day. They didn't have backup batteries, etc., etc. And because there's so much interest, we thought it'd be a great fundraiser for the Merrimac Lions Club. And we appreciate all your support coming here, taking time to hear our little lecture. And I'd like to introduce you a fine young lady. This is Kate Gilbert, who is a tough graduate. And she's kind of an expert on the Titanic. And she's got a little something interesting to tell you, the rest of the story. She has an interesting slideshow. She has some artifacts, history, photographs. And to my knowledge, in a nutshell, I haven't seen much of the Titanic shows or displays or anything like this on the North Shore. So this being in the little tiny town of Merrimac, I think is a credit, because a lot of people don't want to go to Boston or wherever where they have the shows, but we decided to have it right here in Merrimac for the little guy to see. We kept the price low enough so people can afford to come. And again, all the money the Lions Club is raising is used for our Lions Club charities and the Massachusetts iResearch program, and yes, every single penny is accounted for. So let's sit back and relax, enjoy Miss Kate here, and I think you'll have a good time, and it's the best $5 you ever spent. And then again, thank you for your support of the Merrimac Lions Club.
Thanks, Steve. As Steve said, this is the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic this year, 1912 to 2012. And I was actually fortunate enough to travel on the 100th anniversary memorial cruise this past April. And we sailed from England back to New York, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. But I'm going to be combining a little bit of my experience with the memorial cruise together with a cultural history of the Titanic. So let's get started. This is a classic picture of the Titanic that many people can recognize today. Now, when a lot of people think of the Titanic, an image of Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet comes to mind, including this photograph, which he recreated in the movie, if anybody recognizes that. It has become obvious during my study of the Titanic that not many people think of the real-life maritime disaster in 1912. And I also became very interested in how one singular event in history made such an enormous cultural impact that endured for 100 years. So this presentation examines the cultural history of the Titanic, its aftermath, its peaks and valleys and public interest. There are many ways that commercialism worked with the Titanic in order to make it such an enormous cultural icon. So, let's start with why the Titanic was built in the first place. The transatlantic passenger trade was very competitive in the early 20th century. Liken it today to different airlines competing. Remember that ocean travel was the only way to get across the Atlantic at this time. And the two major competing lines were the Cunard Line and the White Star Line. Each competed in its own way for passengers. The Cunard Line generally competed with speed and White Star Line with luxury. In 1906, the Cunard Line launched the Lusitania, which was the largest and fastest ship of her time, followed by the Mauretania in 1907. The Cunard Line had government loans in order to build these new liners due to their high cost. The White Star Line answered this with a plan to build 3 sister ships. The Olympic launched in 1910, the Titanic launched in 1912, and the Gigantic, later renamed Britannic after the Titanic disaster, launched in 1914. The White Star Line was a subsidiary of the International Mercantile Marine Company, which monopolized the shipping industry in the early 1900s. Because of this company's wealth, the White Star Line could afford 3 new ships instead of 2 to compete with the Cunard Line, which was not a member of the IMM. Instead of competing for speed with the Cunard Line, the White Star Line competed with luxury. This luxury was not only meant for first and second class passengers, but also for the third class, which were the backbone of their companies and supplied most of their income. And on a quick side note, the Titanic was not the only luxury liner that sank during this time period. The Cunard Line's government-funded connections would lead to the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 by U-20, a submarine manned with torpedoes during World War I. The British government only funded the Cunard Line so that their ships could be used during times of war. And it is believed that the Lusitania was carrying ammunition at the time of her sinking, making the sinking an act of war. 1,201 lives were lost in the sinking. The photograph to the left is of the Lusitania Memorial in Cove, Ireland, which is also the last port of call for the Titanic. And I actually visited this memorial when we were in Cove because it's the last port of call for the Titanic, so we were there. The Lusitania sank off the Irish coast, and it's even more closely connected to Cove than the Titanic is. Back to the Titanic. The Olympic-class ships, which is the Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, were all built at the Harland Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland. In this picture, the Titanic is being built in the gantries in the background. It's very faint and hard to see, but that's her. The Olympic would have been built next to her in the adjacent gantry. There's room for 2 ships right there. But by the time this picture was taken, the Olympic had already been launched. This is what the Harland and Wolff shipyard looks like today. The metal poles sticking up in this top picture here are the original gantries which held the Titanic and the Olympic. And where that hand is pointing, that's the gantries that are there now today. And for a side note, the cruise ship that I went on is in the background of the top picture, which is kind of funny. Okay, the Titanic was launched on April 10th, 1912 from Southampton, England. Just after her launch, the enormity of the Titanic and the small launching channel created a suction that pulled a small liner in New York away from her mooring, coming within 3 or 4 feet of the Titanic's hull. After her departure, she briefly stopped at Cherbourg, France, and then at Queenstown, which is now Cove, Ireland, on April 11th to pick up more passengers, and her journey was only expected to take 6 days. Ice warnings received from different ships forced Captain E.J. Smith to reroute Titanic's position 10 miles further south, but he kept his speed at 21 knots, the fastest during her voyage. As I said before, the White Star Line did not compete with speed with the Cunard Line. Their ships could in no way beat Cunard's sleekly designed hull design. Titanic's last boilers were not even lit until the 14th, so there's further evidence that they weren't competing for speed, which a lot of people think that she was, but she wasn't. Smith did not slow her down because some of the close ice warnings did not make it to the bridge because the wireless operators were entirely backed up for the night. The officers were effectively unaware that they were driving right into an ice field. In an improbable set of coincidences, on the evening of April 14th, there was no moon out and the ocean was at a flat calm. The combination of these factors made icebergs nearly impossible to see, and I can certainly agree with this because the exact same conditions happened on our cruise ship over the wreck site when we were there on April 14th, and you couldn't see a thing. It was remarkable. With no waves and no moon, the crew, the passengers, and the ship itself were at the mercy of the sea and the surrounding icebergs. The artist of this painting, Ken Marshall, has given a glow to the sky and water as an artistic license only. If this were a real photograph, all you would see would be the lights burning on the ship, and you would not even see that iceberg that is 50 feet away from the ship. And the same theory applies to this painting as well. The Titanic collided with an iceberg, scraping the ship's starboard side at 11:40 p.m. There was no gashing hole in the hull. Rather, the ice sheared the tops of the rivet heads off and in 5 compartments, and the water came in through the connecting plates. She sank at 2:20 a.m., just 2 hours and 40 minutes later, despite the fact that passengers and crew thought that she could not founder. At 4:10 a.m., the Carpathia began picking up the few survivors in the lifeboats. If filled to capacity, the lifeboats were able to hold 1,178 people. Of the 2,223 people on board, only 706 survived. The Titanic was equipped with 20 lifeboats, which were not filled to capacity. The lifeboats were designed to hold 65 people, and just by looking at this photograph, you can see that this lifeboat only has about 20 in it. The photograph was taken by a passenger on board the rescue ship Carpathia, and after the sinking, almost none of the half-filled lifeboats returned to pick up any survivors in the water. This graph is a little blurry, but I'll explain it. It illustrates the lifeboat capacity versus how many people were actually launched in them. The white space on the line graph at the top is space that is not filled by passengers. The colored spaces are the passengers according to class. Red is the first class, yellow is the second class, and third class is green, followed by blue for crew members. This graph is organized also in order by which the lifeboats were launched. So if you take a closer look at the graph, you can see that the first 6 lifeboats that were launched contained only first class and crew, and they were only half full. As the night wore on, you can see that more second and third class passengers were allowed to get into the boats, but there were only 3 lifeboats that were launched full out of 16. Actually 20, because there were 4 collapsible lifeboats as well. On April 18th, the Carpathia pulled into New York Harbor carrying the survivors, and from that point on, it just fired a frenzy of Titanic media. This is a photograph of 2 of the real passengers on the Titanic, Ida and Isidore Strauss, the owner of Macy's department stores. They died on the ship together. Ida was offered a seat in the lifeboat, but she refused to leave her husband. This fact of how they wanted to die together and not apart lived on as an example of loyalty and chivalry to 1912 society. And the real human connections to this story and the Titanic is what really propelled it into the 20th and 21st centuries. Even before her launching, the Titanic was proclaimed unsinkable, which after the sinking only added to the hype surrounding it. This publicity brochure for the Titanic and her identical sister, the Olympic, reads, "As far as it is possible to do so, these 2 wonderful vessels are designed to be unsinkable." The Olympic and Titanic were actually very, very safe vessels for their time period. They were designed with watertight compartments which ran up through E deck. They were also designed to stay afloat with 3 of these compartments flooded. The iceberg, however, opened 5 of Titanic's compartments to the sea, so it could not stay afloat, even though they were very safe for the day, despite what people think nowadays. Originally, both the Olympic and the Titanic were designed with 48 lifeboats, which was cut down to 32, and then sent out with 16 plus 4 collapsibles, so 20 altogether. And although this seems like a really small number, it was actually more than what regulation required in 1912 at the time. In 1912, the rules regarding the number of lifeboats on ships were determined by the tonnage of vessels, not by the actual number of people that were on board. So after the Titanic disaster, that was changed very quickly to accommodate every person on board and not just the tonnage of the vessel. After the sinking, newspapers across the country carried the story even before survivors were brought to New York Harbor. Survivors also started publishing their own accounts of the tragedy. Even people who were not on the Titanic began to publish soon after the sinking. Shown here is author and editor Logan Marshall's book, The Sinking of the Titanic and Other Sea Disasters, which is one such publication in 1912. And I actually have an original copy of this book over on the table if anybody would like to look at it. In 1912, the sinking of the Titanic was fuel for popular culture. Since society in 1912 was by no means secular, images such as this one depicting the helping hand of God arose in religious interpretations of the disaster. Other issues of the time that the sinking of the Titanic had an impact on were women's rights, race relations, class, and labor issues. A specific example of how a sector of society used the Titanic for their own cause was the fight for and against suffrage. The now well-known rule of the Titanic lifeboats was women and children first, and the anti-suffragists used it to their advantage. The ultimate example of this is a poem that I found for the anti-suffrage movement by Clark McAdams in 1912, and it reads, "Votes for women was the cry, reaching upward to the sky, crashing glass and flashing eye, votes for women was the cry. Boats for women was the cry, when the brave were come to die, when the end was drawing nigh, boats for women was the cry. Life has many little jests, insignificant as tests, doubt and bitterness assail, but boats for women tells the tale." The Titanic disaster to the anti-suffrage movement signified women's dependence upon man as protectors, providers, and ultimately political figures. This poem is anti-suffrage inspired because it depicts the instability of the suffrage and the women's rights movements. In 1912, there was also popular culture in newspapers, and this image describes modern civilization in response to the Titanic disaster. It represents one of the lasting impressions that the Titanic has left on the minds of the public since 1912. Entitled "Stop, Look, Listen," the hand of modern civilization, blinded by speed and blindness, is reaching toward into disaster, death, and danger, carried by the black bird of risk. The Titanic became to symbolize overconfidence and technical, logical hubris at the turn of the 20th century. As the Titanic narrative continued into the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, interest seemed to fade, rightly so, with the onset of 2 world wars. Although there were publications, the sheer number of them were not comparable to the number of works published immediately after the sinking in 1912. And it wouldn't be until 1955, when historian and author Walter Lord published A Night to Remember, did interest in the Titanic reach a high point. A Night to Remember was the first book since 1912 to extensively tell the story of the ship and the sinking in a style that emotionally connected the reading audience to the passengers on the ship. Published 43 years after the sinking, the book released the Titanic for a new generation. Seen through the context of the Cold War, the Titanic took on a different meaning in the 1950s as a disaster that was ideal when compared to the quick death associated with the atomic age. Not only were people finding an emotional outlet in the Titanic, they were adding to the Titanic narrative by seeing the disaster through a different context and adding their own interpretations. A Night to Remember debuted on the New York Times bestsellers list in November 1955, and by February 1956, it was at number 2 and had sold 60,000 copies. From the publication of A Night to Remember until the discovery of the wreck in 1985, there were numerous books, movies, even musicals that were published that had to do with the Titanic, including the Titanic Historical Society being founded in 1963, And Clive Cussler's book, Raise the Titanic, published in 1976. And I also have this original copy over on the table too, if you want to look at it. One of the biggest additions to the Titanic narrative was the discovery of the wreck by Robert Ballard in 1985. For the first time, people were able to see pictures of the Titanic since 1912. The technology available in 1985 allowed people to see pictures and video of the wreck, which were picked up by newspapers and magazines all over the world, including National Geographic. Not only was the discovery an emotional event, but it was also an exercise in commercialism, because just as in 1912, people were eager to get out the first images of the newly discovered wreck. This is maritime artist Ken Marshall's representation of the Titanic on the ocean floor soon after the discovery in 1985. These were the first images that people were exposed to of the famous ship in over 73 years. This is a picture of the Olympic's Grand Staircase, which is actually the exact same as the Titanic's Grand Staircase. And after the discovery of the wreck, this is the image that people were now exposed to. The following few slides are comparison pictures from 1912 and from when the wreck was discovered on the seafloor. It is these types of comparisons that only added to the media fire surrounding the Titanic in 1985. This is a picture of a lifeboat davit underwater, which is actually in the released position from releasing the lifeboats to where the lifeboat davits were on the deck. This is a light fixture photograph, also on the Grand Staircase. And this image is very powerful for Titanic enthusiasts, because this is an underwater picture of the crow's nest, where the iceberg that sunk the Titanic was first spotted from. And these pictures were powerful not only because of the long-standing fascination with the ship, but they also reopened those deep human connections that were felt with the Titanic when it first sank in 1912. This is actually one of my favorite underwater pictures of the Titanic, because it's like you can almost hear the band playing or seeing people strolling on the decks. People had been thinking about and writing about the Titanic for decades, and the discovery of the wreck and the subsequent images that followed reanimated interest in the disaster and the ship even once again in the 20th century. Now, in 1985, the hype surrounding the Titanic was at an all-time high, but little did people know that James Cameron could raise that level even higher with a movie in 1997. Not only did this movie incorporate the historical Titanic, it incorporated a love story, and it was this abstract story of love that kept the Titanic alive throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. The love of the husbands and wives that drowned together, and the love of the passengers that were lost in order to save the lives of others. James Cameron actually used the Titanic Memorial in Washington, D.C. as a basis for the I'm Flying scene. The movie struck a chord in the hearts of viewers, but also in the box office. I think it is still the highest grossing film. I'm not sure if The Dark Knight beat it out. You don't know either? It was a night to remember of its time, reanimating interest even further. Now, with all of this said, there was quite a few historical inaccuracies within the film, and as with any historically based film, it shouldn't be taken as fact, and I'll give you an example. First Officer William Murdoch in Cameron's film commits suicide. This is not fact, and many people believe it just simply because it's in this movie. In actuality, Officer Murdoch was responsible for saving almost all of the lives of the men that survived the disaster. Officer Murdoch was loading passengers on the starboard side of the ship and following the order of women and children first. Once they were loaded, he then allowed men on. Officer Lowe on the port side interpreted the orders as women and children only and did not allow any men into the lifeboats. And although Officer Lowe survived and Officer Murdoch did not, there is no evidence that he committed suicide, or any other officers for that matter. This went so far as William Murdoch's family actually sued James Cameron for defamation of character, and James Cameron settled out of court. Fox Pictures even publicly apologized for some of the historical inaccuracies in the film, including the violent way in which the third class was kept inside the ship during the sinking. This brutality did not happen whatsoever. The gates that separated the classes were only knee-high on the actual ship. The only gates that were full-length gates were the gates that separated the mailroom from the passengers. People did what they were told back then in 1912, and it's hard to understand now, but if there was an officer standing in front of a gate and they told a third-class passenger to not go this way, they would find another way. They wouldn't go through there unless the officer abandoned his post, and then they would go through, which is how a lot of the third-class passengers got up to the higher decks towards the end of the night, was because the officers abandoned their posts. The first class was to be loaded first, followed by the second, and then the third, and this was understood, which is why the first 6 boats that were launched were only holding first-class passengers. So it makes sense if you think about it in 1912. And then as the night wore on and it got more and more desperate, they were letting everybody on. The film blew that out of proportion. Just thought I'd share that with you. Not everybody knows that. Oh yeah. Does anybody know who this is? Not you two. It's Margaret Tobin Brown. And it's another example of how the Titanic legend created a myth. Margaret Tobin Brown had a reputation as an activist for social change, so her name was already very well known before she boarded. Margaret Brown was from Denver, Colorado, and she was a minor celebrity of her time. She actually ran for Senate in 1908, which I don't think a lot of people know. She was one of the first women to run for Senate. Brown's actions in the lifeboats earned her the title of a chivalrous woman instead of a man. And after the disaster, she was praised as one who rowed the boats for several hours, encouraging and cheering up survivors and showing chivalry to those less courageous than herself. Although Margaret Tobin Brown died in 1932, her legend was just beginning. In Carolyn Bancroft's 1936 biography, The Unsinkable Mrs. Brown, she fictionalized Brown's life, and incredibly, it became accepted as fact. The fictionalized portrayal of Brown's life was easily accepted by the popular press and the general population because it fit perfectly into the stereotyped version of a Western girl, not properly raised as a lady, who was demanding and an engaged suffragist and social activist. In 1912, people like this were generally frowned upon, especially women, and they were thought to have stepped out of their boundaries as a domestic woman. Therefore, the fictionalized stories gave credibility to her actions and sensationalized her life, connecting with the story of the Titanic. This was to be the beginning of the fascination with the unsinkable Molly Brown, who was never called Molly in her lifetime, that would flourish into the 1950s and 1960s, and even so far as to be portrayed this way in James Cameron's 1997 film, which she also had to apologize for. Today, without a doubt, the Titanic is still on everyone's minds, and commercialism of the Titanic, combined with the sympathy that is felt towards its people and its sinking, I know will fascinate people for years to come. Especially with an image that's such powerful as this, where a body landed on the seafloor and all that is left is its shoes. It's just proof that images like this will keep the Titanic from fading from popular culture. Only proving that the Titanic is not faded from the people's minds. As I said before, I just returned from the 100th memorial anniversary sailing. We traveled to Southampton, England. From there, we went to Liverpool, England, Belfast, Ireland, Cove, Ireland, over the wreck site in the North Atlantic, Halifax, Nova Scotia, and then to New York City. I have studied and loved learning about the Titanic and its passengers for over a decade. And this cruise provided me with the opportunity to visit almost every single historical site that is related to the Titanic. The tone of the cruise was very celebratory of the time period, but it was also very solemn in a memorial sense. There was a lot of respect for the Titanic and its passengers. That's our cruise ship. This is a picture of the memorial service on board our ship on the night of April 14th, 2012. The White Star Line flag seen here was flown off the back of the ship during the service. At 11:40 p.m. on the night of the 14th in 2012, the ship held a 2-minute moment of silence for the victims of the Titanic. And after this, the names of all the victims were called out over our loudspeakers until the memorial service at 2:20 a.m. It was completely silent during those hours. Everybody was just walking around. As I said before, in an eerie coincidence, the moon was so cleverly hidden behind a cloud, you couldn't even see that there was a moon out. The sea was flat, calm, and it was just amazing that a coincidence like that could have happened. This is a picture of the Fairview Lawn Cemetery in Halifax, Nova Scotia, one of the sites that we visited. It was really one of the more emotional experiences for me because it really rounded out the trip, but it also really rounded out the whole fascination that I've had with the Titanic since I was a kid. We started the cruise at a place where the Titanic was built at the Harland and Wolff shipyard, and we ended at the place where its victims were buried. It was a very moving experience. Many of the gravestones don't even have names on them. They just say, died April 15th, 1912, because many of the bodies were unidentifiable. This is the grave of the unknown child. It contains the body of a 2-year-old child that was also unidentifiable. The grave was actually paid for by the crew of the Mackay Bennett, which was a ship that returned to the North Atlantic to retrieve bodies after the sinking. Very recently, the child was actually discovered to be that of Sidney Goodwin, which was identified by a pair of shoes that was found on the child when the body was recovered. And those are the shoes. They're at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Earlier this year, the Titanic wreck site was designated a protected site by UNESCO, which forbids salvaging on the site, as well as throwing objects overboard around the site. And on the cruise, people had brought flowers that they wanted to throw overboard onto the wreck site. And it was strictly prohibited, but not everybody knew that because the law had just been enacted a couple weeks before we sailed. So in light of that, the crew set up a memorial room in the ship's library with people's remembrances, which was actually donated to this museum on the voyage back. For a final slide, I wanted to show everybody this remembrance that was left in the memorial room on board the cruise ship. I'll read it out loud. It says, "To those who perished on the RMS Titanic, you are not forgotten. You never will. With solemn remembrance, Todd Howell." And on the bottom there it says, "I give back a piece of coal that was taken from you." I felt that this was one of the more moving remembrances of the room, and I just wanted to share it with everybody as a reminder that the Titanic will never be forgotten. I believe that this person actually wanted to throw that little piece of coal overboard to return it to the ship, but the UNESCO laws forbid that, so it went back to the Maritime Museum in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So that's my presentation. If anybody has any questions or comments or, yes?
I have an elderly friend whose father-in-law and his brother were crew members of the Titanic. And he swore, he was assigned to one of the half-filled lifeboats, and he swore that they were never told that that ship was in danger of sinking, that it was merely a drill to demonstrate to the passengers that they could be taken care of in the event that there was a serious event, and that they would row out a few hundred feet, wait for the signal,
and then come back.
And everyone would go back to bed.
Yeah. as I said before, a lot of people thought that the ship was unsinkable. So in the early stages of launching the lifeboats, the Titanic wasn't even listing really. So those first lifeboats that were launched were the first class passengers, and like you said, nobody knew that she was going to sink, and it only became obvious that she was going to sink after the first few lifeboats were launched. So the lifeboats that were launched to capacity were probably the ones that sent up the flag that said the ship is actually going to sink.
There's an interesting sidelight to that. There was a third brother who turned up to board the Titanic, drunk as a skunk, and he was fired on the spot.
Yep.
And so he in turn survived.
There's a lot of stories like that. Anybody else? Well, thank you for having me here tonight, and I hope that you enjoyed the presentation and learned a little something. If anybody wants to look at the artifacts or read through whatever I brought, and if anybody has any other questions they'd like to ask me personally, feel free. Thank you.
Excellent speech, a little interesting historical story. As Edward R. Murrow used to say, now for the rest of the story. Well, a few years ago, the Boston Globe ran an obit which pertained to the Titanic. I almost missed it. Big, long obit. I said, wow, this must be something important. Well, back in 1914, when they first received the radio signal, the Titanic was sinking. The guy telegraphed it from the Titanic to ship number 1, to ship number 2 related to ship number 2, related number 3, went to New York. A little kid, 12, 13 years old, on top of the skyscraper in downtown New York, was the first U.S. person to receive the signal of the Titanic. Evidently, the gist was he worked for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or whatever it was, one of the big papers as a gopher. So he got this story in it because he was just experimenting. He's only 12 or 13. And he says, wow, this can't be. So he ran downstairs, he got a hold of his editor, who happened to be in that night, and told him he just received a wireless, the Titanic was sinking. So the editors told the kid, oh, you must be dreaming, you're fooling around, you don't know what you're talking about, because the Titanic is unsinkable. Now, this is in the Boston Globe a couple of years ago. And one thing led to another, so the editor of the New York paper decided to run the story anyway, just to kind of cover your butt. Well, come to find out, he was the first newspaper to run the story about the sinking of the Titanic. Well, what's interesting with this conversation right this second is that little kid became a very, very famous person. He grew up, became an electrical engineer, had all kinds of degrees, he was a prodigy, this, that, and everything else. And he ended up being the owner and president of RCA Corporation, which back in the 20s and 30s and 40s was one of the mega corporations in New York City. Well, he just died a few years ago, and because he was the guy that received that very, very first signal, because he was a prodigy and interested in the telegraph. And he just died a few years ago, and that's the rest of the story, which showed up in the Boston Globe just by accident. But anyway, excellent. You get the gist of what really happened. You think it's cold today, you should have been there that night in April. But again, we applaud you, and we wish you well, and you really had everything right on the money.